My dad crushed my dreams just to protect the golden child, my spoiled sibling, by refusing to pay for my college tuition while handing everything to them on a silver platter. Years later, after building my success from the ground up without a cent of his help, I finally got my sweet revenge in a way that left him stunned and regretting every decision he made. I'm 32, and my brother is 28. Our dad, who's 56 now, raised us after we reached middle school. From that point on, my dad consistently showed favoritism toward my brother, and over time, I just accepted it. I was never the type of son he truly wanted, mainly because I didn't share his passion for sports or the typical manly activities boys often pursue. Instead, I gravitated towards more traditionally feminine pursuits, which is why I was a huge mom's boy growing up. I loved everything about cooking, getting lost in books, and even singing. My dad tried to get me interested in football, but I simply wasn't good at it, and we slowly drifted apart. My brother, on the other hand, was everything my father desired in a son. He was a rough and tumble kid, unafraid of getting dirty while playing or even getting a few bumps and bruises. He was the ideal son for my dad, and it was undeniably clear that my father preferred him over me. He always had wonderful things to say about my brother, but never about me. My mother, however, never played favorites. She was equitable with both of us, and that's precisely why I adored her even more. I genuinely tried to bond with my dad and spend time with him, but once we'd grown distant, he didn't seem particularly interested in mending our relationship. Tragically, the person who held our dysfunctional family together, my mother, passed away when I was in 8th grade. She had been battling cancer, and by the time we fully grasped the severity, it was too late to save her. She was gone before we truly knew what hit us. My mother's death completely shattered me, and I found myself in a difficult emotional state during that period. The only comfort I found was in the kitchen, and I'd create something new every single day, as if my very existence depended on it. My mother was an exceptional cook, and she often told me that if she hadn't been obligated to take over her father's business, she would likely have become a chef. So, cooking became my sole source of solace, especially since my dad and brother offered no help in processing my emotions. They suppressed any grief they felt regarding my mother's passing, and if anything, became even more distant from me, whereas in most families, such a tragedy would typically bring people closer. My intense focus on cooking irritated my dad even more. He would constantly badger me to get out of the damn kitchen and engage in something more masculine. One day, after he'd had enough, he even threatened to make me do all the other household chores if he saw me in the kitchen again. He told me to emulate my brother and man up, which ignited a massive argument where I told him he never loved me, and he actually agreed. It was finally out in the open, and I suppose that was essentially the last day my father and I communicated with such candor, because after that, I stopped attempting to win him over entirely, and he didn't appear to care either. For the next few years, I spent all my available time in my room, listening to music and studying new recipes. I was resolute in making this culinary path succeed, not just for myself, but also for my mother. Meanwhile, my dad and I only spoke when absolutely necessary. My brother didn't show much concern for me either, ignoring me just as our dad did. So, after my mom passed away, I essentially had no one I could truly rely on. Finally, when it was time to apply for colleges, I decided to apply to a few top culinary schools in addition to traditional universities, just to ensure I had some options. I wasn't sure if my dad would approve, but I had to at least try. I had already secretly interned at a restaurant that summer, gaining valuable experience, and managed to secure a recommendation letter, which proved incredibly helpful. As a result, I did get accepted into several of the schools I'd applied to, including one of the best, which happened to be in France. I was absolutely thrilled that this was finally materializing for me, but I was equally apprehensive, as it meant needing my dad's permission. I had already decided to plead with him to let me go if he seemed hesitant, because I simply had to make this happen for myself. I was unwilling to abandon my dreams under any circumstances. So, I eventually told my father about it. and while I was braced for him to reject my request, perhaps claiming it wasn't a masculine profession, I was utterly unprepared for him to refuse to pay my tuition altogether. I still remember being genuinely bewildered when he told me he wouldn't be funding my education at all, especially since my dad wasn't remotely poor. In fact, he was quite well off and could easily afford to send me to France. But money wasn't the reason he wasn't willing to pay my tuition. It was because if I went to France and attended such a reputable school, it would make my younger brother feel insecure. As it was, he was struggling with his grades and couldn't focus. So, my dad wanted me to either attend community college or find a way to pay for my own tuition. I was stunned that he would act so cruelly towards his own son and didn't know what to say. I tried to explain that I needed this, but he was unyielding and absolutely unwilling to contribute to my tuition. He even stated that my brother's well-being was his top priority, and he didn't want me competing with his son. I could barely believe this was happening, as I couldn't imagine any other father in the world crushing their child's aspirations like this, simply for their favorite. After much pleading and crying, when he still refused to budge, I ended up in a massive argument with him where I said many things before leaving his house for good. I began living with my maternal aunt, my mother's older sister, instead. The only reason I hadn't moved out sooner was because I found comfort in the house where I'd grown up with my mom, and also because I didn't want to change schools, which I'd have to do if I moved in with my aunt since she lived quite far from my high school. I explained everything to her about my dad and how he had outright refused to pay my tuition, and that I needed her assistance. It felt awful asking her for a significant amount of money, as she wasn't as wealthy as my dad, but she assured me she would cover all my expenses somehow. She managed to gather contributions from all her friends and sent me to the culinary school of my dreams, and I will forever be thankful for that. Once I was there, I also worked part-time and strived to make the most of my time, ensuring all the money being spent on me was worthwhile. I worked incredibly hard and advanced my skills. When I graduated, I was one of the most proficient chefs there, and even secured a job just a few months after graduating. I started working at a truly high-end French restaurant and sent half my salary back to my aunt to gradually repay my debt. I was fortunate that I didn't have to rely on student loans, or I might never have been able to pay any of it off. Anyway, I worked in France for a few years before eventually moving back home once I had saved enough to open my own restaurant. It's been a couple of years, and in the interim, I worked as a head chef at another restaurant here, while simultaneously working towards my goal of establishing my own place. Everything was finalized a few weeks ago, and I was finally able to open the restaurant I'd been working towards for so long. 2 friends from my time in France also joined me in this venture and are co-owners, which is why I was appreciative when they allowed me to choose the restaurant's name. They happened to be from the same state, so we were all agreeable to opening our restaurant in my chosen city. I decided to name it after my mother, which turned out to be a fortunate coincidence. For us, as her name is quite beautiful and uncommon in our home city, everything was finally falling into place. A few days ago, we even hosted a small private gathering for select guests before officially opening for business. Of course, I invited my aunt and a few of her friends who had also contributed to my tuition. I also invited some of my old school friends, but that was pretty much it. I didn't invite my father and brother for obvious reasons. Even if I had wanted to, I couldn't have, since I hadn't spoken to them since I left home, and they hadn't bothered to get back in touch with me either. I suppose we were all better off this way, but I should have known they would definitely show up to capitalize on my success someday, and that's exactly what happened at the party we threw. They appeared an hour before the party was scheduled to begin, but weren't stopped by security since we shared a last name, and they claimed they were there to surprise me. At least that part was true. I was certainly surprised when I saw them. My dad and brother greeted me, as if nothing terrible had ever occurred in the past, and were incredibly warm towards me, probably for the first time in my entire life. I was too shocked to react initially when they first entered the restaurant. My friends noticed something was amiss, and after politely greeting my family, they left us to ourselves, and I'm grateful they sensed my discomfort. I still hadn't recovered from the shock of seeing them again when they dropped another bombshell on me and presented a gift they'd brought. It was a portrait of my mother, and my dad even told me he had commissioned it for me to display in my restaurant as soon as he heard that a new, prominent restaurant with that name was opening in our city. He'd known it could only be his son, and even claimed he'd always known I had it in me. My brother, too, was eager to join in, praising me and declaring how immensely proud he was. I couldn't believe my ears and instantly knew something was very odd about all of this. I didn't say much and kept waiting for them to get to the point, because I knew there had to be a reason for their presence. I let them talk, and eventually they revealed their true motive. Apparently, my brother was now working as a bartender, and even that was only possible because my dad had convinced a friend of his to give him a job at his club. My brother's grades had consistently declined throughout high school and college, which is why he didn't secure the high-paying positions my dad had always expected from him. On top of that, he'd also been lackluster during his high school football games, which prevented him from getting a sports scholarship. Ironically, he was the one who ended up having to attend community college because he was rejected everywhere else. What they wanted me to do was make my brother a partner in the business so he would have a more respectable position, even though he had done absolutely nothing to earn it. I had the urge to laugh in their faces, but somehow managed to restrain myself, and instead told them I'd consider it. I wasn't actually going to think about it, though. I just didn't want to turn them away. I wanted them to stay for the party, because I had a much better plan in mind to humiliate my family, who had emerged from obscurity as soon as they received news of my success. They seemed reasonably pleased, but they had no idea what was about to unfold. After a while, our guests began to arrive, and within an hour or so, everyone we'd invited was there. I spent the evening socializing while my dad and brother did the same, and I even overheard them bragging about me to a few people, marveling at their sheer audacity. Towards the end of the party, it was time for the hosts, namely myself and my partners, to give a toast. My friends went first, as I wanted to save the best for last. Finally, it was my turn to speak, and that day, I was finally going to truly express myself. I began by thanking all my guests, and raised a drink to my mother first, since she was the very reason I had ever been able to achieve so much. I strongly believed that her faith in me as a child had instilled the belief that I could accomplish any of this, and that belief had stayed with me even after she was gone. After I had paid my due respects, I decided to address the disrespect as well. I brought up how I'd had to secure a loan from my aunt and her friends to attend culinary school and thanked her as well. Then, finally, I got to the reason I'd had to take a loan for my tuition in the first place: my family. I explained how I'd grown up with a father who never loved me or had any faith in me, and always criticized me for having feminine interests like cooking, and a younger brother who was a carbon copy of my dad. I told everyone about how my dad had refused to pay for my tuition out of fear that I'd become more successful than my younger brother, his golden child, which is why I ended up leaving home. But despite all odds, I was able to rise and become who I am today. So, in a way, they did deserve some credit for creating all the challenges I've had to overcome, or else I never would have discovered my own resilience. Many people shot my dad and brother the nastiest looks they could muster while I was saying all of this, and even they had the good sense to at least appear ashamed, even though I knew they didn't feel that way in the slightest. Anyway, I then walked over to my dad and brother and actually hugged them, maintaining the same pretense they had when they visited me earlier. Two could play this game. I announced that because they had shown up to celebrate my success today, I'd forgiven them for whatever had happened in the past, and was even prepared to offer my brother the job of bartender at my restaurant. To others, this obviously seemed like a genuinely emotional reconciliation, and they ended up actually clapping for me at the end of my speech, with a few wolf whistles. Only my family and I knew that this was nothing more than an attempt to humiliate them, which I had done quite successfully, but they had to smile and act as though they were incredibly grateful for what I'd done, since they couldn't exactly storm out angrily, which is precisely what they wanted to do. After a while, when the crowd had dispersed and it was finally time for us to leave, My dad and brother confronted me right outside my restaurant. They were furious, and I swear there were angry tears in my brother's eyes. They demanded an explanation for my actions, and asserted that if I had never intended on making my brother a partner, I should have simply turned them away as soon as they arrived. I just laughed, and told them this was my way of repaying them for everything they had done for me over the years, and this was exactly what they deserved. Then I walked away, and didn't bother to look back, even when I heard my brother crying about how this was the cruelest thing anyone had ever done to him, and even yelled after me to tell me I'd regret this. But I didn't care, since I was already in my car and driving away. That happened a couple of days ago, and I haven't heard from them since. My aunt thinks I might have gone a little too far with this one, and should have just asked them to leave. Initially, but I don't agree with her. This was well deserved. Update 1. Hey, I decided not to reach out to my family to apologize, despite what my aunt said about me being too harsh. I don't feel remorse for what I did, so I'm not going to pretend I do, and go out of my way to say so. They could have taken the opportunity to apologize to me when they visited, but they didn't. I explained this to my aunt as well, and while she still believes I shouldn't have acted as I did, she hasn't said much more about it. I guess this is just one of those areas where we agree to disagree, and I'm okay with that. In other news, my brother has made sure to go behind my back and badmouth me to all our mutual friends from school. It's unfortunate that we attended the same high school, as this simply means random acquaintances from school are now texting to confirm the rumors that I humiliated and then ejected my dad and brother from my restaurant after intentionally serving them 3-day-old food. Yes, he exaggerated the story to portray himself as the victim, which is pretty unsurprising. Ordinarily, I wouldn't care about petty rumors, but I don't want potential customers taking these rumors seriously. So, I've texted my brother that, if he doesn't stop spreading falsehoods about me and my restaurant, I'll ensure he loses his current job. I'm hoping that works, because I really don't feel like dealing with their unnecessary nonsense right now. I'm genuinely busy with work, and this just isn't the time. Update 2 LOL. My brother texted back saying he would only stop if I made him a partner. I don't even comprehend this level of stupidity and delusion. Besides, if he wants to be a partner, isn't it a pretty dumb idea for him to be talking trash about the very same restaurant? I'm pretty sure this is my dad's tactic to ensure his beloved son lands a high-profile job without doing any actual work. But unfortunately, it's not going to work with me. I've told him that if he doesn't stop, he'll be hearing from my lawyers, and that he's in absolutely no position to be negotiating with me right now. The only reason I haven't done anything yet is because I don't want to get caught up in unnecessary drama, but I'll definitely mess him up if he tries anything funny after this, and he should take this as my final warning. I truly hope he does, for his own good. Update 3. So, guys, it's been about a month since the last update, and since I've been really busy, I haven't been able to fill you all in on what happened next. My brother did stop talking negatively about me behind my back, but they were still quite desperate to capitalize on my success. So, my dad decided to pay me a visit with my brother a few weeks ago, purely to intimidate me. They showed up at my house threatening to sue me for using my mother's name for my restaurant, and even claimed they'd already spoken to a lawyer. So if I wanted to avoid trouble, I needed to make my brother a partner as soon as possible. Obviously, I immediately called their bluff, as no lawyer would take on such a ridiculous case. I think they were overlooking a very important fact. She was my mother too, not just his wife. And as far as I was concerned, no law could prevent me from using her name. By then, I had enough of their nonsense, so I told them that if they didn't leave me alone, they'd be forcing my hand, and I'd have no choice but to call the police. My brother lost his temper at that point and tried to grab me by the collar, but luckily my dad held him back. I think the constant humiliation had finally gotten to him, and he'd snapped. Well, it wasn't my fault, and they were fortunate that I didn't call the police right then. I told my dad that he needed to get out, but he only told my brother to go cool off in the car and that he wanted to speak to me in private. After my brother left, He tried to manipulate me by telling me that if my mother knew what I was doing to them, she'd be really upset with me, and I should bury the hatchet at this point. I told him to leave me alone, because even I was at my limit. He couldn't just use my mother to get his way. That was just low. And to be honest, we were way past the point of reconciliation. Not once had either of them apologized to me, so I really didn't understand why they expected me to forgive them without even asking for it. As for what my mother would feel, I'm sure she would have felt equally let down back when my father had refused to pay for my tuition, and for that matter, every single time he made me feel awful about myself. So he should be the last person to lecture me about what my mother would and wouldn't like. I know she's proud of me wherever she is, and nothing my dad says is going to change that. At least my restaurant is doing well, and hopefully we'll be able to expand soon enough.